All right, I'm going to talk to you today about CSS. We're going to introduce this. It's the first time we've kind of talked about it. So let's talk about the foundations in depth a little bit more. All right, so what is CSS? It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Style sheets define formatting rules that are applied to text, images, forms, and embedded and layout elements on a page. A style sheet's comprised of styling rules, that's what they're referred to as rules, which then are applied to HTML to control visual presentation of pages. So if you remember back when we talked about structure versus presentation, well, structure would be the HTML, right? It's the actual content and the semantic way that it's set up through the tags. And styling is going to be through CSS. So each style sheet rule is comprised of three things: selectors, properties, and values. Okay, that's kind of an important thing to remember. Okay, so when we talk about rules, this is an example of like a really simple rule. And in this case, this is something that would style all instances of a paragraph tag in the HTML. So let's break this down a little bit further. Okay, so in pink, we have the P tag selector. And you'll see later when we get into this a little bit more, there are different types of selectors. In this case, it's referred to as a tag selector. So it's going to find every instance of a paragraph in the HTML, and it will apply this rule because it knows that this is going to select P tags. Okay? That's a way to think about it. The selector is going to know what to select in the HTML whenever it encounters it. And then it will apply this other thing, which is called a declaration block. The declaration block is going to be enclosed inside of these curly braces. Okay, so when you open the curly brace, that's the beginning of the declaration block, and when you close the curly brace, it's the end of the declaration block. You have to have beginning brace and ending brace. That's absolutely important. Otherwise, your CSS isn't going to work right. Okay, so let's talk about what goes inside the declaration block. First of all, this entire thing right here is called a declaration, where it says color, colon, and then it has this hexadecimal value for a color, and then it terminates it with a semicolon. That whole thing is referred to as a declaration. You can have multiple declarations within a declaration block, but to keep things simple, in this example, we just have one declaration. We could also have things like, in addition to color, we could also have things like text shadow, or we could have margin or padding, things like that. But in this case, we have just one declaration. Okay, so let's break down the declaration. Inside of the declaration, you have a thing called a property. And in this example, color is the property, because what we want to do is we want to define the color of the paragraph selector, okay? And to define that, we then have to give it a value. All right, so the value is going to be the value associated with that property. All right, in this case, it's going to be sort of this gray color, 333333 in hexadecimal value is like it's like a gray, and that color is going to be applied to the property which is referred to as color. And then in the end, what we have to do is we have to end that declaration with what's referred to as a terminator. In CSS, the terminator for a declaration is a semicolon. Okay, and so if you just take another brief glance at this, you'll see that we have our selector, and then inside of our declaration block, which is going to be in yellow, we have our declaration, and inside of the declaration is a property that has a value, and then it gets terminated so that we know that so that the browser will know, okay, now I'm ready for the next declaration, or I'm ready to end the declaration block and move on to the next CSS rule. Okay, so I mentioned, that paragraph tag was an HTML selector. Well, there are three different types of selectors that you can have. You can have an HTML selector, you can have an ID selector, and you can have a class selector. All right, and let's talk a little bit more specifically about what each of those things does. And by the way, this part is very, very important. There's some things that I kind of tell you occasionally that, you don't have to remember this right away, or whatever, but this is pretty important. You're going to need to understand that we have different types of selectors, and you need to know what those selector types are. HTML selector, ID selector, class selector. Okay, so let's talk about HTML selectors. They are going to basically use standard predefined HTML tags and format them accordingly in a web page's code. And so for instance, let's go back to our former example where we had this paragraph selector. All right, well, in the CSS, you wouldn't put the braces around that P the way that you would like whenever you've got this actual P tag right here, right, that I'm circling. Oops, I just advanced it by accident. So right here where I'm sort of circling this P tag, that's the HTML part, right? But up here where I've got my paragraph selector in the CSS rule, it doesn't have any braces or anything like that around it. All it is just a regular old P, okay? And then it has these curly braces with a declaration beside it, all right? Now, that means that it knows to find every instance of a paragraph in this particular example on the page and make it this dark gray color, okay? There are also ID selectors, and ID selectors will only occur once in a page, typically as a unique layout element that's not to be repeated. All right, that's actually pretty important. Then an ID is really only supposed to ever be used one time on the page. And when I say one time, I don't mean that it could never be, used again ever in a different page. It's just on one page that you want it to be used once. Okay. Okay, and you can, with an ID selector, you can call it whatever you want. You can make the name up. It's something that you invent, if you know. So in this example, we have an ID selector called content, and you'll see that the way that we delineate an ID selector, let's say from a paragraph, or excuse me, an HTML selector, is that you've got this hashtag in front of it. You always would put a hashtag immediately in front of the name of your ID in the CSS, and that way we know that it's an ID selector. There's no space in between. Okay, notice that. And then just like the other example, you would have a declaration block and curly braces. Okay, and so if we wanted to, let's say that we wanted to style something in the HTML using this example of this content ID selector, you might have something like this down here at the bottom where it says section. Section is an HTML tag. So you'd have section as the tag, and then what you would do as an attribute, you use the word ID as an attribute of section equals, and then the value would be content. And you notice that here where I say ID equals content, you notice that I don't put I don't put the hashtag here. I only put it whenever I'm defining the rule in CSS. But here it's ID equals content in quotation marks. Okay. And then finally, we also have class selectors. Class selectors are going to be things that you can repeat as many times as necessary in a page. All right, so maybe an example of an ID selector would be something that's a specific layout element. Maybe it's a form that's only going to happen one time on the page, or maybe it's something like a banner. Maybe you've got a banner on the page that's only ever going to be visible in one spot. Maybe that's an ID selector. But a class selector, let's say that maybe you've got several products on a page that you want to style in a certain way, and you want all the products to look the same. You would use maybe a class selector for that, because then you can style it multiple times using the class name. So an example down here is this class that's called my class, all right? And the thing that is going to delineate a class from an ID selector or say a tag selector in the CSS is it's going to have a period in front of it or a dot. So it would say dot my class to actually create the selector. If you leave that dot off, it's going to think that it's some kind of HTML tag called my class, and that doesn't exist. All right, so you would have to put that dot there. And then you could give it some sort of declaration block. And you see here that we have two declarations in the declaration block. We have margin left of 10 pixels, and then it terminates. And then we have color and this is the value for white, and then that terminates, okay? So if we wanted to apply my class to something, it could be applied to anything in the HTML, but let's say that we want to apply it to a paragraph tag. You can look down at the bottom and you see that we have the P tag, which is in green, and then in yellow we have the class attribute. So class is going to be an attribute whenever it's used in the HTML part. Okay, so you'd say class equals, and then my class. And just like in the last example with the ID I showed you, you don't put that dot in front of it here. You only put the dot in front of my class whenever you're defining it in the CSS. Okay, you can also use multiple classes, by the way. So like, let's say that I wanted to apply you know, something that was a class called English, and that meant that it was going to underline it. But also maybe Spanish was another class, and it has a color of gray associated with it, some version of gray, which is what this 666 number is. All right, well, if I wanted to apply both of these styles to something, so I could say, in this example up at the top where it's a paragraph that says Ron is in the, and then bilingual education program, then what I could do is I could wrap a tag around bilingual education program. In this case, it's a span tag. And then I can give it the attribute of class equals, and I can say Spanish space English. So if I want to apply two classes or more than one class to a tag in the HTML, then I define it by saying class as an attribute. All right, so class equals, and then in quotation marks, I would put the first class name with a space after it, and then the next class name, all inside of those quotation marks. And so then it would actually apply both an underline and the color gray to the words bilingual education. All right, there are also these things called CSS pseudos. Pseudo is going to be a selector that gives specificity to rules based on a condition. All right, so for instance, maybe you only want the rule to apply when someone hovers over a link with a mouse. All right, here's the CSS syntax of the rules if you wanted normal links to be yellow, okay, and maybe hover states to be red, and maybe the previously visited links should appear in green. All right, so here's some examples. Let's say that we want all instances of A tags to be yellow. So we've got A, and then we have our declaration block that says color is yellow. Okay, then if you look below that, we have A : hover. There's no space in between A : and the word hover. It's all run together. So A : hover. All right, and you don't have to italicize that. That's just for visual effect. All right, so it's A : hover, and then you would do your declaration block, and it would be red. And then A : visited is another pseudo state. All right, and you don't have to know all of those things right away. You know, you're going to learn like that hover is a common thing that you're going to use as a pseudo state. Visited might be something else that you'd use. Another one might be called a focus, so that when you're currently clicking, you have your mouse down, it shows that you're currently clicking something. That's another example. That's active, not focus, it's active. But what is important though is that you understand that all instances of A are going to be yellow, but the things that you want to change in the pseudo state, you're going to have to change them here to override the original thing that happened in the original state. Okay, so the original state here would just be the A selector, and then the pseudo state of hover is going to change it to red. The pseudo state of visited is going to change it to green. Okay.